Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on international mail presented by Mary Law. Just some quick housekeeping while folks join the webinar and get seated. As usual, we will be recording today. It will be available in about 48 hours afterwards for our mailer subscribers on the website in the webinar archives. I will be making the handouts available throughout the presentation here. In fact, I'll do it again here in the chat box. You'll see the file pop up. You just click on it and download it right there. And as always, questions are going to be welcome. We're going to try and address them kind of as we go through the webinar, since we are going to cover a few different topics. So please submit your questions via the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will get to them as we can. So while we get started here, I'd like to introduce Mary Law, our presenter today. She is the president of WorldVu LLC and is an internationally recognized expert on international postal addressing and on international mail matters. So we are very lucky to have her. She's a member of the Universal Postal Union POC Addressing Work Group and of the U.S. International Postal and Delivery Services Federal Advisory Committee. So she's got a lot of expertise to share with us, and this is something we don't always cover a lot. So please download that handout, get your questions ready. And if you'd like to learn more about Mary or WorldVu, I encourage you to visit her website, worldvu.com. And Mary, I'm going to mute myself and let you take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. So we're ready for the second slide, which is our agenda. We're covering a lot of topics today. We're going to spend some time on customs, only because that's where a lot of the changes are, and there's been a lot of confusing information on it. Next slide, please. This disclaimer is that I'm not an attorney or an accountant, and there is information in here that is based on laws and legal requirements. So if you do not understand something and I can't answer your question fully, it may be because there are specifics that apply depending on the country of origin, the country of destination, exactly what's being sent and all of that. So I do encourage mailers to seek opinions from their attorneys and accountants when they need to do so. So let's go on to the next slide. We're seeing more and more regulation, and there's more and more both inbound and outbound. The USPS has ramped up its export compliance checking. Mailers are getting things sent back to them that don't even leave the country. They're just not making it through export compliance. The EU's ICS2 Release 2, which is their customs and information ramp up, is requiring more information. And as we see more and more of this information being sent back and forth, there's a need to store things that used to move quickly. There are staffing requirements that aren't necessarily being completely met at customs. This leads to delays, and of course, it leads to returns. And more scrutiny means there are more tax assessments. If every package is being looked at, every package is taxable. There are also more requirements on the acceptable packaging and content of goods. This is particularly, again, with the EU, where there are a lot of requirements for green packaging. So plastic wrappers for periodicals are not acceptable in the EU anymore or in the UK. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that in other particularly developed world countries, Australia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Canada. I think we're going to be seeing more on, we don't want your plastic. And there are more restrictions on dangerous goods. I think we've all seen or heard of presentations by Dale Kennedy of USPS on that. The dangerous goods requirements are actually, in my opinion, good for those of us who fly on airplanes, because there's mail in those airplanes too. And I would prefer that there not be a fire. There are more privacy regulations and laws both here and abroad. Right now, we're not seeing any real conflicts with these and the information being required, but we may come to a point where that does happen. So let's move forward to the next slide. This is basically some information about where you can get information about what is not allowed, what the prohibitions are, what the restrictions are, and who controls them. Most things that we mail are allowed. I mean, if they weren't, we wouldn't have mail that worked very well. But there are both sanction programs from the United States that every US mailer, every US company actually is required to follow. That's that first Department of Treasury. The export requirements and limitations from the Department of Commerce comes next. And then the CBP's basic information on import and export. And there are links here to what license requirements there are. In addition to the IMM, USPS IMM, which has very good information in their specific country listings about what is and isn't allowed, the International Trade Administration has some guides for this too. So let's go on to the next slide, please. And we come to customs and duty, customs duty and sales tax. Now, customs duty is a tax. However, we don't think of it as a tax as in a sales tax. More countries are requiring sales tax payments on both digital and physical imports. And digital and physical imports can also be subject to duty. Sales tax and customs duty are separate charges and often from different government agencies. So you can end up paying sales tax but not duty, or duty but not sales tax. It sounds odd because we're used to it either going through without a problem or there being a fee. But that's being changed as we move forward. There are more requirements for more and more information. This is where the conflicts with privacy regulations may at some point come into play. HS numbers, which are the Harmonized System Classification, are required in some countries and required in all of the EU plus Switzerland and Norway as of March 1st of this year. If they're not on the package, it's going to be returned in most cases. There are more taxes and fees. And whether these are because of protectionism or revenue production or security, that might matter in how it moves forward. Certainly, this is opening up fraud opportunities with the requirement that a tax ID be on the outside of the package. I mean, I don't think any of us would put our social security number on the outside of a package. There have been fraud with this, so if you are using a tax ID number on something, you should be checking your account regularly to make sure that you're paying the correct amount. Next slide, please. So let's do a customs overview because that's where, like I said, where most of the changes are happening. The USPS collects information from the shipping services file and the online customs form and information entered at the retail counter. Any of the mail containing goods requires a printed customs form in addition to the electronic information that is sent. The USPS export compliance checks that basic requirements are met. The sender and recipient's addresses, those are obvious. Phone numbers are required in some cases, and emails. The description of items enclosed, including the value and weight of each item. Some other information is required by some countries. We're going to get to what that information is. AED, which is advanced electronic data, is sent to the foreign post the requirement. So they send the AED, the post comes back and says, okay, we'll accept that package. We need more information on that package, or don't send that. This is where we get into some of the delays and some of the requirements for more storage space as these packages need to be held. If the package is approved, the customs inspectors in the destination country can still bar it from entering the country. This is just a preliminary based on that electronic data. Should also be aware if you are a USPS known mailer, that program may be ending. This is allowed printed matter and low value items to be sent without a customs form. If that program ends, those items are likely to require a customs form in the future. This, I think, has some problematic issues with it, but we'll see what happens. Next slide, please. Okay, customs. When are the forms actually required? Any merchandise, any goods sent to non-US addresses, including gifts and donations. They're not required for letters or documents, but books or quantities of forms are considered goods, and anything on electronic media is considered goods. Merchandise to FPO, APO, and DPO addresses and to US addresses in Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and the former trust territories also require customs forms. There's a slight difference in the form. It's got a US barcode on it rather than a UPU barcode on it, but the same basic information is required for each item in the package. I've listed here the state abbreviations and the sections in the DMM where you can find more on this domestic items. Next slide, please. So, package can contain multiple items. The online customs form, I believe, limits it to 15. It may be somewhat more than that, but quite a number. For each item, you need a detailed description, not simply clothes. It has to say it's a man's wool shirt or cotton socks or a toy doll, not just a toy. The quantity of the items with that description, the weight of each quantity of items in pounds and ounces. So in the example I've put here, I've got 3 man's wool shirt. Sounds a little odd to say that. That's the total pounds for all 3 shirts and the total value for all 3 shirts. Obviously, I've made this up. But you need those detailed descriptions. For business mailers, each item requires an HS number, which we'll look at on the next slide, and a country of origin. Using the wool shirts up above, the country of origin is going to be where value was last added. So if the wool comes from Australia and was dyed and woven in India, and then cut and sewn into shirts in Thailand, the country of origin becomes Thailand. This can get more complicated on more complicated goods and manufactured items. So that's where I said earlier, you might need to consult with someone. And let's go to the next slide. This is what the harmonized code system looks like. There's a chapter, a heading, a subheading, and those first 6 digits are definitely what are required. Then the last 2 codes change depending on the country of destination. There's 2 information sources here. The first one is the International Trade Center, which just talks more about the rules of origin. And the second one is what's called Schedule B. That's the USPS listing of the harmonized codes. And the next slide has an example of what you see at Schedule B. So here it is. And you can go down and browse through the chapters. You can do a search engine, whichever you find most useful. Next slide, please. On this slide, yes, I know the text is small, but I wanted to get as much on as I could. There are 90 some chapters, and you can see it's very detailed as to what's in each chapter. You go down and look at it, you click on that chapter, you can then get into more and more detail, or there is a lookup capability. Next slide, please. We're going to change here to addressing, but let me pause and ask if there are any questions at this point on the customs.
The chat box right this second, but a couple of things did come to mind while you were presenting. One, there was one question about how content concerns are being addressed for inbound and outbound items that are contraband or prohibited.
The requirement of a more detailed description is handling that, as well as the USPS export compliance. If it's dangerous goods, there is a checkbox that you need to make to indicate that it is dangerous goods. And USPS will double check that this item is allowed by the carrier that they're using, and that it's allowed to their destination. And that, so more and more, if you're putting something in that is problematic in some way, it'll be returned to you before it's even left the country.
Okay, very good. I did
Okay.
have one other question to you. You had mentioned more countries in the UK are no longer accepting plastic. There are more environmental concerns. The resources you mentioned a few slides back, I think it was 5 or 6. Do those resources kind of help outline any of those environmental
Yes.
restrictions? Okay, very good. And do you have any recommendations, I guess, to make sure that folks are prepared for that?
I would suggest in the USPS IMM, which is the International Mail Manual, there are individual country listings, and those listings give quite a bit of detail about what is not allowed to be sent, and also specifics on what information must be included on the customs form.
Oh, we did get one question here. Did you say the HS number is required on all packages? If mailing a letter with a player's casino card, is that required?
It probably wouldn't be required if it's not being purchased, because it would fit in a flat envelope, I presume. I'm not sure what a player's casino card is. But if you're sending it to somebody who's purchased it, you need a customs form. And therefore, in the EU, Norway, and Switzerland, you need an HS number.
Okay, thank you. If I'm thinking what this might be, like the player's casino card might be like a plastic membership card. Karen, if I'm
No,
not mistaken.
that would be considered a document.
Okay. Okay, correct, she says. So it's considered a document. So
Okay.
okay, very good. All right then. All right, I think we're okay. Thank you.
So we're going to move on to addressing. We're seeing a lot of recent changes in addressing. Germany, for example, has said that they have a requirement for a street address for package delivery, no post office box or parcel locker delivery. I suspect a couple other countries are likely to go in that direction, although none have yet. Physical addresses may be legally required for forms, but they might not be mailing addresses in all countries. There are some countries that will only deliver to a post office box or a postal locker, but may require a physical address, so that it's a kind of know your customer thing. That can be a problem when you're filling out some of these forms, because how do you put 2 addresses on a customs form that only has 1 address space? That's not really being well addressed at this point. I do know that the Universal Postal Union, which is the organization of the postal operators in all the countries, are looking at these and trying to figure out what to do about it. The other question is, do these addresses below, which we'll look at in a minute, meet your database requirements? Could you put them into your database? And will they meet USPS export compliance? That I don't know yet. There's no answer on it. In Kenya, you can use a mobile phone number as an address. Now, this is in a major city, it's Nairobi. They call the person, and the person decides whether they want it delivered to a physical place or they'll come to the post office and pick it up. And that is an address. The one in Brussels, Belgium, is from actually the B Post, which is the Belgian postal operator. They have a customer ID. BPAC and De Broekère is a postal station in downtown Brussels. That's enough information to get the package into the postal locker. If you can't handle these in your database, or if you have know your customer requirements that require more address than this, you're going to have to be prepared to have some mechanism to handle these odd addresses. We're seeing more and more phone numbers in addresses in addition to the address lines. And recently, one of the Arab countries has required that they want a home phone number in the address, which is very similar to what Ecuador does, along with the house number, building name, whatever their address requires. So we need to keep looking at this as an evolving area, but look at the phone number as part of the address is going to become more common, I think. So let's move on to the next slide. We're starting to see some postal operators in some countries that have, frankly, I was polite and called them failing rather than failed. A colleague in South Africa hasn't gotten any mail for more than 9 months. He says the post office there is virtually defunct. Ecuador's postal operator was reorganized, but there's still very poor delivery, along with many other Latin American countries. Any of you that mail to Latin America know the problems there. Saudi Arabia's postal operator was reorganized because there were trust issues in the post, and costs were also an issue. Costs were going up and trust was going down. They've reorganized it. It's a little messy at the moment. These are just examples. I mean, we can talk about other places where it's not working well. The USPS suspensions list lists some problems, but not all of them, because countries don't always report these issues to the UPU. They consider it a sign of a collapsing country. You know, it's an embarrassment to say our post office doesn't work. But there are alternatives to official postal operators in some areas, particularly in Latin America. And many countries now have liberalized postal systems where there are other postal delivery companies other than the official post. And the way to find out about some of this is, other than watching your own mail, talk to companies who deliver in the same areas that you do. You may not share competitive secrets, but you frequently will share whether the mail's working or not. Next slide, please. So for all the failed postal operators, we're still seeing delivery expected in a shorter time by consumers. The big changes in logistics are all around robotics and AI and technology. You've got fixed or known routes. That's what the USPS traditionally has done, where they deliver to every house every day. Same route, back and forth. Next day, same route, back and forth. Versus dynamic routes, which is what Amazon Prime trucks do or FedEx trucks do. They go to where they have to go. Dynamic routes tend to save money over fixed routes, but they're slower. And they don't always know where your mailbox is. For example, you know, your regular letter carrier knows where your mailbox is because your regular letter carrier comes every day. The FedEx guy or the Prime guy doesn't come every day, so may not know where to put the package. We're going to see more and more tension between those two because of the cost savings and the advantages. They each have an advantage, but not enough advantage one way or the other. Robotics, AI, and smart system technology are changing warehouses. We're getting autonomous delivery by vehicles and by drones. inside buildings and outside on the street and in the air. Inside buildings is pretty much solved. Outside on the street and in the air is not. There are still accidents, there are still problems, and there are still legal blocks to delivering in some areas. My own opinion is that this is going to be much more used in remote locations. So for example, remote villages in Alaska, places in Wyoming or Utah or Montana, in mountainous areas where they won't have to send somebody up there every day. They can do it by a remote vehicle. Tracking is part of logistics, and we've got two things going on in tracking. If we use people to do it, we've got dependence and reliability that the person has to remember to do it exactly the same every time. Technology dependent, we don't have the reliability problem, except that we do have power and satellite problems. So if a satellite goes down, the power goes out, the technology tracking isn't going to work so well. RFID may be a potential solution to some of that. We'll see. So do we have any questions at this point again, Michelle, before we move on?
We do actually, and they kind of tie together. So first, the first question here is, are things being enforced now other than known mailer? And she's referring to about the rules in general with the new required documentation and how strict it is.
Yes, USPS is definitely now enforcing that.
Gotcha. Okay. So then in follow up, with all the different requirements for each country, is there an easy way to automate the required forms for each country?
My own advice is to include all the information in a database with the, if you're the e-tailer, add all the information into your product database. So you've got the description, you've got the HS number, you've got all of that. If you're a mailing service provider, I would say work with your clients to get all that information, because you have to get that information from the mail owner, to use USPS terms. The person who's actually putting the package together knows what's in it. The mail service provider may not. So I'd say that you need a database with this. And it should be the product database, ideally. For mail service providers, keeping up to date and keeping a database of the requirements, the strict requirements, at least for countries. Yeah. Yes, I'm an international mailer. I've got it easy. We mail books. Books have a description. They're called books. They're all under the same HS number, but I have worked with companies that do a lot of different items. Once you've got the HS numbers in the database, HS numbers are good for 5 years. The new list came out last year in 22. It's good until 27. And the US Trade Administration and Commerce Department do put out information about what's changing in the new guidelines for the new HS numbers. So you don't have to redo the whole thing once you've got them.
So and follow up to that. So does the customer provide the HS number, or just a description of the product and the MSP has to look up the HS number?
That is up to, I'd say, the service provider.
Gotcha. Okay. So
you need a detailed description to get the HS number. And if you're getting that detailed description, it wouldn't be that much more difficult for the mail owner to add that HS number into their database.
Gotcha. Okay.
Along with the description.
That makes sense. Okay. All right, then I think that's what we have for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next slide. So returns. It's kind of related to all that we've been talking about. got 4 different kinds of returns these days. Refused by export compliance. That was new in 2022 when they started it, and they've gotten stricter. So we're going to see more and more of that. Then we've got refused at customs. This is where the customs in the destination country says, no, we're not going to take this item. Since they're looking at more packages, and in the case of the EU, they're looking at every package, we're going to see more of that than in the past. We've got undeliverable as addressed. We all know that problem. And then we've got delivery not accepted by the addressee. As more and more countries are charging taxes and duty, there are more and more packages not being accepted by the addressee if they are required to pay a fee. USPS is working on what's called a DDP solution, that's delivery duty paid, where you can collect the amount up front from your customer and you can pay it and it doesn't charge, they don't get charged at the end point. But right now, if you're not paying the duty and the tax up front, your customer's being charged. It's not an easy solution to navigate. There are some companies that help with that. If anybody wants a few of them, I can send a short list. Timely returns are easier, but delays may be due to lack of recipient action. If something comes right back and it was legally sent, the return's not going to be a problem. But if the recipient holds it for 6 months and then tries to return it, then we can have some problems with customs coming back into the United States. There are some countries that have outbound customs. Customers who live in those countries are likely to be aware of it, but there may be outbound customs. The United States does not have an outbound customs by constitutional article. So we're not used to it, but it does happen in some countries. Just be aware that if somebody says, oh, I can't return this to you because my country wants me to pay, yada, yada, they may be telling the complete truth. Next slide, please. Cyber attacks and grids. Royal Mail was down for weeks a couple months ago because of a cyber attack. And I'm going to suggest here that it's not just cyber attacks. It's all of these different grids we work with. It's a transportation grid. It's a communications grid. It's an electricity grid. And all of that together. And that these systems need to be dependable for us as businesses to work well. And that mail depends on all of these internationally and on most of them domestically as well. The most disruptive thing toward the grids at this point is not actually, excuse me, cyber attacks and terrorism. The big problems right now tend to be weather-related storms and poor infrastructure and maintenance, particularly in less developed countries. On the storms front, there have been, over the last few years, mudslides and bad floods in parts of Australia and New Zealand, and some roads just are not being rebuilt. So addresses that existed along them aren't coming back. The earthquake in Turkey, there's still no buildings in most of the places where those terrible earthquakes happened. I'm not diminishing the loss of people here. I'm just commenting that the infrastructure doesn't automatically pop back up. There was a bad cyclone in southeastern Africa a couple months ago, Cyclone Freddy, which is still wreaking real havoc in the area. So you have to watch the international news if you're seeing that there is a storm or a major, I mean, it would be like mailing into a hurricane here. Your mail's not going to make it. So you do have to watch those things and correct your address database if you find out that a city like the cities in Turkey were really devastated. Anything else? I see that there are questions again.
I do have a couple questions here for you. So just to clarify on return mail. So
Mhm.
all reasons of return mail require a fee or no? And I guess if there is a fee, who's collecting that?
For return mail, if there is a fee, it's usually collected by the country that you mailed to. So what I would call the destination country.
Okay.
And it's usually a tax authority. This again, if the mail comes back in a really timely manner, there's probably not going to be a fee. So you should encourage people that are doing returns to you that if you really physically need to get the item back, rather than recycle it in the country of destination or the region of destination, which is always also an option, the fee is going to the country, the
Okay.
tax authorities.
Okay. And does the outbound class of mail change anything with that?
No, the outbound class of mail, there are classes of mail for which there are no returns. You'd have to check. I don't have it in my head at the moment, and I don't want to misquote it. But in the IMM, they list the pieces of mail or the classes of mail where returns will not be done. There is also on the customs form a place where you can say, if this is undeliverable, I want it returned, or don't return it. So if it's something that you can't restock and reuse, it may be less expensive to have them keep it.
Okay, that's interesting.
I mean, just, to be honest, you're going to have to take the word of your customer, however, that they actually need a new one if it's a damaged goods problem.
Interesting.
That's always an issue. We all know that one.
I think that's all we got right this second.
Okay, well then let's move on and take a quick tour of the world. What we're going to do here is we're going to go around the world very quickly. Recession and inflation are still issues. There are some countries that are officially in recession. Whether we default on our debt or not, they're already in recession. Inflation in some other countries has been much steeper than it has in the US, which means the exchange rate is not always being very favorable. There are increasing disruption and conflict, not just the Ukraine, but also think about the protests in France. Somalia is back in hunger. Sudan has two warring factions. It's not necessarily a real peaceful world at the moment. That grid dependability thing, the severe weather, and increasingly I'm hearing discussion, are we moving from a rules-based world order to nationalism or to something else? This will matter as countries get more and more protectionist if we're moving away from the rules-based world order. We'll see. That's not that you need a real good crystal ball. So in Europe, as we've talked about, more regulations, particularly green and global warming actions. The UK, since the UK left the EU, there's an increasing discrepancy between what the what the EU requires and what the UK requires. Watch that discrepancy, because you may end up with the UK changing rules and the EU not doing so. We've gotten kind of used to looking at the UK as part of Europe, and it's really pulled itself away as separate from Europe. Also in the UK, it's not only Scotland that's interested in more local control. Northern Ireland and Wales are also making some noise about that. What goes on there? If they start getting more local control, will they be allowed to change import rules? If they do, that becomes problematic. Then we've got Ukraine, which has created both a worldwide food shortage, starvation in Somalia, and an energy shortage because they were a net exporter of grain and energy. So that war in Ukraine is affecting the developing world substantially. Russia, we're going to have continuing autocracy, whether Putin's there or not. And we're seeing more unrest and disruptions in Russia, more protests against the war, more questioning of the war, more arrests. In Africa, Chinese and Russian influence has gone up. There have been anti-French demonstrations in some of the former French colonies, and the French are blaming it on the Chinese in particular. It's become a dangerous place in some places, again, where it hadn't been in a while. There are also new trade blocs in Africa. Generally, these are good overall because they're encouraging more and more industry, which means more and more markets for our goods. But some of them are protectionist. So protectionism is something to look out for as you look toward Africa. Next slide, please. And the Middle East, where we've got 3 former empires competing, and then Israel and Palestine. 3 former empires are the Mohammedan Empire, Saudi Arabia, the Persian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. So Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. They push against each other. They think that they should all be the primary guy in the territory. Recently, Saudi Arabia, very recently, as a matter of fact, within the last few days, Saudi Arabia has reached out to Iran and has been somewhat conciliatory, which was a surprise to many people. And since I saw it on a bunch of news feeds, it was a surprise to many people. And Syria has recently been brought back into the Arab League, which was unexpected. So we may be seeing some more quiet in the Middle East, which would be lovely. The ceasefire between Israel and Palestine seems to be holding. War is not good for most marketers. So the Americas, status quo more or less. In the US, outbound and inbound scrutiny, and watch the sanction lists. USPS is watching them. So if you do try to mail to someone on one of the sanction lists, it will come back to you. And if you continue to do it, you will be fined. Their violence and ineffective governments continue in some Caribbean and Latin American countries. We'll see what happens with the US border, but without some control in some of the countries where there are problems, and here I'm thinking specifically of Venezuela, we're going to continue to see those migrant issues coming up from there. Violence and ineffective governments also means poor delivery of mail, stolen packages. Anybody who's mailing into Latin America knows that this has been going on for years. So it's no real surprise. In Asia, they're continuing tensions in some countries and stability in others. Myanmar has recently been causing some tension in its border regions. China, of course, there's increasing military militancy, and there are tensions with Chinese companies which want a little more Western type freedom of action. Chinese government is not allowing it. It's interesting, again, to kind of keep an eye on it. And then there is Taiwan. And Taiwan and semiconductor concerns. Taiwan manufactures well over 50% of the semiconductors that we use in cars, in printers, in my computer, and yours. We ordered a new kitchen stove a couple years ago, and we had to wait and wait and wait because they didn't have any semiconductors. So, they affect a lot of things. North Korea, of course, remains problematic and dangerous. Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia are quite stable, and there's quite a bit more prosperity. There is a middle class. Southeast Asia, we're talking Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, that area. There is a prosperous middle class growing in that region. India has a growing middle class. All of these are markets for American goods. So, next slide, please. So these are a couple more resources from the US government. There's the International Mail Manual, if you don't know how to get to it. The postal bulletins come out every 2 weeks, and there are announcements in there about changes that'll be made to the next update to the IMM. And that's it, unless there are more questions. Last slide, please. And if there are no more questions today, you can email me and send me your questions later. I will answer them if I can.
I would absolutely encourage people to do that because there is so much to this, Mary. My goodness. One thing occurred to me while you were speaking. You mentioned a little while back that some countries are starting to require phone numbers for addressing. Are there any other data privacy or data security concerns that kind of come along with that? Or is that just, if that's what the country requires, that's just
If
what it
that's
is?
if that's what the country requires for postal address, then it's okay to do it.
Okay, interesting. I guess I just thinking of that like in the context of like a lot of the privacy, data privacy concerns going on in the US. That's interesting now that they're going to put your phone
Yeah.
number on mail.
Somebody in one of the Southern African countries said, well, you don't have a problem having somebody be able to walk up to your front door of your house, but you don't want them to have your phone number? And I thought, oh, different way of looking at it.
I don't necessarily want them walking up to my front door either, but I don't
I
know.
know, but when you give them your address, you've given them the ability to do that, unless you use a post office box.
This is true. This is true.
So they just saw their phone number as not being as revealing as their home address.
Interesting.
Yeah, I kind of thought that was different.
That is, I see what they're saying. I guess I was thinking in terms, like sometimes with two-step security or we get verification codes or anything like that. Or every so often I get a spam for my Google voicemail. Please just confirm your phone number. I just was thinking of it in terms like that.
Yeah, no, there is an agreement as part of the UPU agreements that postal addresses are, if they're used for postal purposes only, are exempt from privacy regulation. Now, that doesn't make them safe in your database without permission, if you're talking about the EU. But I've had this discussion with people when I said, well, you want me to send you a physical book, I need your address. Well, I don't like to give people my address. Well, you just ordered a book, a printed book. Um, I don't know how to politely explain that I can't send it to you without your address.
Bit of an
You know,
impasse there.
well, and we all have occasionally those kind of discussions with somebody. I suppose I could make that sigh longer and deeper. Um, I try not to do that to other people when
Oh,
I'm the one on the other end of the phone. No, I think that, like I said, if there are questions, because I do know that this is a lot and we did a lot of different topics. It's just that these are where I'm seeing that we're going to be getting a lot of changes.
perfect. Thank you very, very much, Mary. Again, here is her contact information on the screen. The handout has been available in the chat. If you have your chat window open, you can download the PDF there. It does have the links she was referring to throughout the session with all those resources to help sort out those HS codes and get those environmental regulations and such. Again, this was recorded, so if you're a Mailer Hub subscriber, you can look forward to being able to review this about 48 hours. I'll let folks know when I get this up to the website. And Mary, if I'm not mistaken, we have some on-demand training, I think, on international law. We're going to have
Um,
ready for you shortly.
We are going to have that ready shortly. Yes.
Very good, very good. So plenty of resources here, as well as Mary herself. Thanks again for joining us today, folks. Next time you can look forward to hearing Leo moderating again. He's on the road today doing the good work of Mailers Hub. So I appreciate you joining us. Mary, thank you again. And everyone take care.
And thank you and have a great day, everybody.